Okay, I will try to talk a bit about innovation, lean and agile, how they relate to each other, if they do, and about some myths and misconceptions about these things, and especially when agile and lean are used in combination, I would say in contamination with other approaches like lean startup, design thinking, whatever. Quick question for you. Are you using Agile or Kanban at work? Yes. And are you doing some kind of innovation or just plain standard work? More the latter. Huh? Okay. Anyway, if you are here, I guess you are interested anyway a bit about innovation. So let's start from Agile. And let's start from where it started. That is, it started after the failure of the traditional approach, the idea of knowledge work as manufacturing, a mechanistic view of the work. So in separate steps with silos of people focusing on one step and blah, 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 you know the story. It failed miserably with spectacular failures. And this fixation on a plan actually is one of the characteristics of that approach. We know everything up front, we plan it, and ta-da, you get punched in the face. And the reason is that knowledge work has a lot of complexity in it. I think some of you are familiar with the Kinefin framework or not? Yes, but those are experts. Kinefin. Oh, can you read it? It's a bit. It is Snowden. It's a way to represent the domains we are working in. And I will be very fast and make it a bit too fast maybe, but on the right there's the domain of the known, the knowledgeable, knowable, things where things are either obvious, like eating an ice cream or tightening a screw, or are complicated, where an expert is required, like to build an airplane. But in general, in this area, cause and effect relations are very well defined, or either trivial or long chain, but you can understand how cause and effect are related. Now, if you move into a complex domain, these relations are not anymore so easy to understand, and you can also in retrospect understand what happened, but not define up front. Think to burning a fire in the woods and trying to keep it under control. You don't know exactly how things will go. Maybe you burn the wood, maybe everything works fine and you keep the fire under control, but for sure after the fact you can say, oh, this has happened because, but for sure you cannot do it before starting. Chaos is your house taking fire, and then you need to act immediately and do something. In knowledge work, most of the times we are in that domain, in the complex domain, where there is no tight relation between cause and effect, between knowing in advance what will happen and knowing in advance what is the right thing to do, also in terms of practices. Best and good practices stay here. Here we only have emergent practices. We try to do things, see if they work. If they work, then maybe we can move them here and try to sort of norm them. Now, when dealing with innovation, typically you have a sort of cycle that can start either from chaotic reasoning ideas, but typically from here, and you try to move to a more controllable situation, but always in a way that this starts new ideas and this loop basically goes on indefinitely. The point is, have a clear understanding that you need to understand in which context, in which domain you are, and then you need to act accordingly. If you try to use an analytic approach to a situation where you are a lot of uncertainty and unknowns, then you are going to fail. And that's exactly what the waterfall approach tried to do. Use this kind of approach to a problem that is not possible to deal with using that approach. And one of the reasons is the uncertainty that is intrinsic in knowledge work. It's not like manufacturing. You know what's coming in and you know what will come out. In knowledge work, you know, sometimes you know what inflows, but who knows what the outcome will be. Patrick this morning stated this very clearly. So in general, we have an unknown destination when we start. Even if we have the illusion of the perfect requirements, that's typically a false illusion. We really don't know where our effort will lead us. And we only know by doing, by learning while doing. So let's get back to the Agile Manifesto. Probably most of you know it. And typically everyone remembers very well the 4 sentences, individual interaction, blah, blah, blah. But the premise for the manifesto is this one. So we're uncovering better ways of developing software. So it's about building software and only software. So the ones of you that know the whole approach and holistic view of the system, typical of Lean, will start thinking, oh, maybe this is a local optimization. And yes, it happens a lot of times that maybe we do some nice work in that context, but then it doesn't fit well with the rest of the company, and sometimes it creates more dysfunction. That's one of the reasons, by the way, the DevOps movement started, because that was a crisis created by Agile people delivering too much things too much quick, and YOPS operations not being able to keep that pace. So it's not so much about building the right products, and for sure it's not about design and innovation. So in terms of product, yes, there was a lot of effort in trying to talk with the customer, interact with him to understand what he wants, but unfortunately what he wants is not necessarily what he needs. And so in terms of innovation, from the product point of view, the Agile Manifesto doesn't help us so much. It helps us with the practices. A lot of innovative engineering practices have been introduced, especially by XP. So pairing, unit testing, continuous integration, that are now part of the standard set of tools we are using. In terms of process, well, the manifesto focused more on values and principles than specifying a process. And that's the good part of it. That is, I'm not telling how you do it, how you should do it, but what are the beliefs, assumptions that are behind what you should do. We'll see later that unfortunately things went wrong in many instances. So the idea is to use an empirical kind of process control, not the defined process control that we have in waterfall. So this idea of continuously trying to do things, inspecting what happened, and adapt the process to what we do. So in terms of innovations, yes, there were a lot of innovation in the way to do things, and especially in the way to deal with people and focusing on their interactions that are the key part of making a team, an organization really shine. That is, trying to make the interaction between people as effective, easy, and productive as possible. So all these concepts like cross-functional, stable teams, self-organization, etc. were introduced by Agile and are definitely a key part of its success when applied appropriately. And the other thing I think I would say are loops. Loops in a lot of different way. Loops in terms of iterations, loops in terms of feedback loops that we'll find also in Kanban. It is constantly checking and verifying if what we are doing meets the needs of the customer, the needs of our colleagues, etc., and constantly adapting to this feedback. Now, let's look at Lean. Well, first of all, Kanban, that has a lot of roots in Lean. And by the way, when you say Kanban with the capital K, we're not referring to Taiichi Ohno's Kanban in manufacturing, just to avoid any confusion, was born in a maintenance context. Dragos, Dimitri, and David tried to use it in Microsoft. By the way, ironically, with a company that was CMMI level 5 certified and still was not delivering at all. And product innovation was definitely not on the table at that time. So quick look at Lean. Well, first of all, there is a clear connection with Agile in terms of focus on the people, and these are the pillars of the Toyota temple, and are respect for people and continuous improvement. Continuous improvement to the process that so is constantly changing is done by the people themselves. So this is a clear tenet of the Lean approach. The process is owned, changed by the people that do the work, not by top manager imposing the way to work top down. So I think you are familiar with the 3 M's, Muri, Mura, Muda. So try to reduce or remove overburden, variability, and waste. Now, I think that everybody is fine with reducing overburden. But if you look at variability, well, here is where the difference from manufacturing is really huge, because variability is intrinsic in knowledge work, and trying to remove it is simply silly, because we are not creating over and over the same pieces, and the inflow of requests is, well, in a way unpredictable. And by the way, at this point we know very well that variability, diversity, whatever, fosters innovation. So in terms of reducing variability from an innovation point of view, that's definitely a no, or at least watch out. The same is true with waste. While we obviously want to avoid wasteful activities or queues or waiting times as much as we can, Lean, for instance, focus on avoiding underutilized resources. That's not what we want to do in knowledge work. And even for the reducing risk of failure. In a manufacturing process, that's perfectly understandable. But if you try to mitigate the risk of failure, sometimes we prevent a lot of interesting things and ideas to develop, especially if we are doing research experiments. If we choose too quickly which path to go, then we probably lose a lot of opportunities and options. And that's why in knowledge work we often talk about slack, that is, let's say, reserving capacity to be able to act or react very quickly. That is, never have people utilized at 100%. And that's also, I think, one of the innovation that the Kanban approach brought to the table, because this is blasphemy in a manufacturing context. By the way, I worked both in IT context and in manufacturing context, and just having people doing nothing was sort of crazy. But sometimes, also in that context, it is better to have people do nothing instead of doing the wrong things. From a financial perspective, that's often worse. Or only the fact that you're creating inventory, that is, you start something and then you stop because you started that where resources were available, it's far from ideal. So, how do we learn about products? Well, one of the issues is really try to differentiate between needs and wants, and between problems and solutions. Because typically we tend to focus here, and that's wrong. That's especially if we want to innovate, we need to spend time on the left of those two things. That's what people, customers ask you, but not necessarily is the right thing. It's the way they can express their problem, and they typically do it as a solution. I want this feature, without really trying to understand what's their problem. So it's I want versus I need. And by the way, speaking of learning, that is a connection with how do we learn. And for innovation, this is very important, but also for innovation in terms of process, not only product. That is, we typically work in this kind of loops. We decide how to do something, we do it, check the results, and then accordingly we act and change our actions. By the way, this is also the PDCA loop, more or less. What's the problem with this? Is that the assumptions behind these actions are hidden and are never questioned. And that's exactly what we try to do when we try to apply double loop learning. Chris Argyris is the guy that started talking about this. So the idea is also trying to question the assumption and check if our assumptions are valid or not. Because if we keep looping here, say we do our plan, it fails, oh, we need to become better at planning. And so let's spend more time, try to do the perfect plan. And that's wrong. Our assumptions, we should change. Some in complex and uncertain contexts, it makes no sense to do better plans. Remember the Tyson picture? The problem is that our mind is easily falling into this trap, and a lot of other traps, what are called cognitive biases. For instance, when we try to gather requirements or ideas, we typically fall into the trap of when there is a first or second idea that we like, we immediately focus on that, excluding a lot of others. That's a mechanism that comes from evolution of our minds. So it's called first fit pattern matching. The first thing that more or less matches with our expectation, and it's okay. Something is moving behind the bush, could be a lion, let's run away. This is also a typical one, confirmation bias. If I already started with my mind not clean, not fresh, but I already have something in mind, everything I do tries to confirm that idea. And so, again, that prevents me from reaching a good result. So what happens then is this, that we have our innovation teams focusing on solutions, and we leave our customers with their problem open. So we really need to avoid this, to understand the needs and to avoid those biases, and never spend time in if our assumptions are not tested or validated. And Patrick this morning talked a bit about the lean startup approach. And this is basically on continuous loops on building something very quickly, check if this is what we expected, the result, and learn and adapt continuously. Actually, it goes, in a sense, it goes the other way. First you build your hypothesis, then you define how you will measure, how you will test that that hypothesis is valid, and then you design an experiment, or MVP, as it's called in Lean Startup. And close to the Lean Startup approach, there is what is called Lean UX. That basically is applying Lean Startup approach to UX. You know, UX stands for user experience. It became in the years a very heavy process, where designers were becoming more of a documenters, big documentation of wireframes, a lot of pictures, and the goal of UX at the end was producing a lot of paper and documents. And so the Lean UX approach started to adopt the same way to work that Lean Startup. Actually, they call it slightly different, but the essence is the same. Make, check, and think. So what's your hypothesis? Let's verify, possibly with metrics, how it works, and then think and cycle. So the idea is that those cycles can fail, and actually should fail. This comes from the information theory. If you do an experiment and your probability of failure is 0, then you will succeed for sure, but you will learn nothing. You're redoing something that you already know how to do, eating an ice cream. The same applies if the risk is total failure. But the more you go in the 50% area, the more you're going to learn, even if the experiment fails. So, and this leads us to the safe to fail approach that's so popular today. But you should be very careful, because failing is not always good. It depends in which context you are. So if you are in innovation mode, that's fine, and that's definitely something perfectly normal. But if you are in execution mode, well, failing is not exactly ideal. So on one side you can take risks, on the other you probably should play it safe. And failure is okay if you learn, but in this case it's mostly harmful. So then it all boils down to the culture of the organization, if it accepts or rejects failure. Because if it rejects failures also in a context where it should accept it because of fear, for instance, then that prevents innovation. Nobody is taking any risk, because if they fail, they are killed. Okay. So a lot of loops, try to do things, adapt, pivot, if, as Lean Startup used the word pivoting. So watch out again, because you can abuse loops if you go into this loop fixation. There is one very nice example from David Bland. Can you read it? Yeah. What he calls the product death cycle. So no one uses your product. So let's ask customers what features are missing. We implement those features, and oops, that was not the problem. And that's a typical issue, if you focus on features instead of understanding problems and needs. So this is one problem. The other is what I call reduction to linearization, because loops are so popular now. Everybody talks about loops, but then sometimes these loops are used basically in a linear fashion. I would say that in Scrum, this is often the case. That is, yes, we use iterations, but to create a perfectly frozen kind of product defined from scratch from the beginning, and we only do it with cycles, but basically it's an iteration to a known destination. I don't know if some of you are familiar with design thinking. Yes? So design thinking is a very good idea from, by the way, Roger Martin, IDEO CEO. So the idea of starting with a goal, not with features. So a better feature, a better future, and with considering this present and future condition, taking care of the known but also of the unknown, design thinking can bring you to very interesting solutions. The problem is that often we end up in this trap of having, again, a linearized approach. That is, yes, we do loop, but only when we are in this area. Then linearly we move to the next area where we, from the general mystery part, we start to apply heuristic until we define, finally, algorithmic and product, basically. So what happens is basically this. We move from complex to complicated, yes, using loops, but at the end, it's just a standard linear path. While if you remember the initial picture, the idea was to be always looping in these ideas, trying to better define a norm, but from there starting again to chaos and again to the innovation. Now, I found this in a 2014, so it's pretty recent, article in Harvard Business Review, and was related to the innovation process. And so you see these nice loops, so everything is happy because we see some loops. But if you look below, well, to me this looks like a Gantt chart, huh? In some phases we use design thinking, then we use Agile software, then Lean Startup, or in parallel. Actually, Agile software is part of Lean Startup, so that's a bit, we always fall into that trap of linearizing everything. So, I don't have so much time left, but so one of the issues that obviously prevent innovation is what I was probably mentioning earlier. So Agile and Lean has often became sort of routines, recipes. The work, we do iterations, we do poker planning, we are all happy and we do our iterations and we march like soldiers, and the people, the roles, the PO, the marvelous bottleneck, that is the PO. So, and then we reach these, nice, wonderful pictures of our future. So, if you remember the uncertainty slide with unknown destination, well, this is exactly the opposite. That's the destination. We don't care what are you doing, where you start from, but for sure that's the final destination. Oops, not exactly. And then we have the typical, but Agile is only good for software, or Lean is only good for in manufacturing. Now I have a few pictures of companies I worked with or I'm working with as a coach. And this is an electronic board. This is a home automation panel. This is a power transmission object. No software there, definitely. This is a bathtub. And these are all companies where I've done or I'm doing coaching and applying Agile and Lean values and principles. Let me call them like that. So, well, most of you are doing Lean and Agile, but I'm sure you know this diffusion of innovation picture, very popular. But in general, people not yet doing this are, I would say, already in the late majority, at least in terms of outcomes. The problem is that people in this area really, in general, look for recipes. That's what they want. Because the early adopters and majority really look for changing. These other guys are typically only trying to, okay, everybody's doing this, so we have to do it. Give us the recipe and we'll follow it. I think you know that Toyota let people visit their factories. By the way, I've been there twice, because they know that even if they copy what they're doing, they will never be like them. Indeed, there are no Toyotas out there, because they will change everything in a few months. And then there's the mythical, oh, but we tried it and it doesn't work. Now, the thing with when you change, besides change resistance and all the other aspects, with process improvement, you always think that things will go like that. Okay, we change, wait a bit, and then things will start improving. Unfortunately, the reality is often these. Things will go worse for a while. And so this area is what causes most changes to fail, because then we say, oh, it doesn't work, we stop. Maybe we do it also iteratively. Try, no, it doesn't work, try something else, doesn't work, try something else, etc. And then you give up. And then people is really say, oh, no, not yet another change, please. So in terms of process and innovation, there's no way you can cause innovation. Definitely. That's not going to happen. But for sure, you can create a condition and enable innovation to emerge from the way people work. So research and innovation need to be integrated into your flow, in what you're doing. Otherwise, you end up squeezing it in a corner or creating other companies that are doing innovation for us and never really connect. So let me close with a link with Patrick's presentation, because Kanban in its discovery, with its discovery hat, is exactly something that can really make innovation emerge. For instance, if you manage it and risk at the portfolio level, so all the first phase here is exactly the discovery phase in terms of ideas coming and maybe going through business case and assessment. And guess what? You find here lower and upper limits to the WIP, as in Patrick's presentation. So some of these will be rejected, and that's perfectly fine until there's a commitment point when that thing is committed, and then we move into delivery. Well, actually, to be honest, there is still some discovery done here, but it's minor, definitely. So I think more or less I'm done. And I would say, yes, Lean and Agile may help with innovation, but they will not do innovation for you. They can only help you in creating the conditions to make innovation happen. And that's all. So that's it. So, any questions? I'm going a bit too fast maybe, but okay.
Yeah, so I got a lot of ideas of don'ts from the presentation, and also I think the conclusion was quite accurate. But imagine a company that is doing software development that is already applying ideas from either Agile or Kanban successfully. What would be the next steps that you would think you would recommend in order to set up the proper conditions to foster innovation?
So you're saying we are already doing Agile or Kanban or whatever, yes, but we are not innovating so much. That's what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
Or you want to foster it more?
Okay. Well, depends. Again, if you're using delivery Kanban or Scrum, then you are focused a lot on the part that comes after, identifying what you need to do. And so then you're focusing on doing those things. That's not so much discovery or research on that, right? And so if you're using, I don't know, are you using Scrum, Kanban, what?
We're actually using more Kanban.
Kanban, okay. But for the delivery phase, I assume, yes?
Yeah, it's mostly.
Okay. So maybe you should start implementing some of the boards that Patrick was showing. Have you been to his presentation? Unfortunately not. Maybe you can spend time with you and me, he and me. But the idea is to, let me go back to here. So you basically are working in this area, right? Committed things, work on them, validate. So the idea is to start focusing here on where your ideas come from, how do you work on them, how do you do research, how they move to a stage where they are not more ideas, but they become maybe business cases, and agreeing on the criteria to do that. Remembering try to avoid killing ideas too soon, because then that could be a painful mistake. And then you move then to the feasibility phase. Remember the three, they are feasibility, viability, and desirability, right? So you always should check on those things, and this happens before you start doing the real work. But that's the key important for your future, and if you want to innovate, you have to spend time there. And visualizing your work on that area. That's the first step. What's going on in terms of identifying what we'll do next?
So basically, there's a whole set of Kanban systems that follow the principles of the core practices and principles of Kanban in terms of visualizing new things that actually help you visualize and manage the flow in the discovery process, not just in the delivery process.
Yeah. And try it. Don't be afraid to fail.
Are the same people involved in the delivery and discovery phases?
Not necessarily. In general, I would say not. Discovery is more close to the business, to the designers, and so to people that's more close to what will be the needs and what will the market need. But always be careful, because having diversity helps a lot in elaborating these ideas and reaching following paths that are not the obvious ones. But for sure, then sharing as much as possible and keep transparency on this, that's also a basic ingredient of making this succeed. So transparency should apply across the board. But for sure, developers working with everyday things are not typically involved in this. Maybe they are involved when you do some kind of feasibility, technical feasibility.
When you're talking about fostering creative environment.
Well, some ideas from the people that do things are obviously very interesting sometimes. So having them anyway involved in these sessions where you produce ideas that typically comes from the external world, but can sometimes come from internal. Sometimes you do what I call design studio, for instance, and then involving developers there could also be very effective.
My question was exactly the same.
So,
Amazing.
answer is okay?
More or less. In a big company where I was working for last year, we were exploring how to use Lean Startup in the discovery phase.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a problem. They need to build prototypes so they can check if they need to reject or
Yes.
or commit to implement that idea. So have you had the same experience or something similar, and how did you manage to integrate developers that are not how can I say that separated from the delivery IT people?
Okay, so your problem is how to involve people that typically busy with delivery in the discovery phase, because maybe you need to build something and etc.
And I
etc.
don't, and at the same time, I don't want to
Disrupt, yeah.
to take people out of the
Create a separate team.
analysis, thing.
Well, good question. That's not a trivial problem to solve, because the typical way to do is we create an innovation team.
Yeah.
But then that breaks the link and the synergy, and all the good of having people interacting is lost. So it depends also on how long to take these loops, because in theory you want these loops to be as fast as possible. So then you should try to be as liquid as possible in terms of assigning people. But for sure, if you are able to have, let's say, the superstars not involved in the routine delivery, but the very good ones to be available on call to work on these experiments, that could be for sure a good strategy. Remember, avoid overburden, slack. So Slack is for sure a solution for that. Okay? And fine. Okay, thanks.